I have had to battle even today. I've debated deleting my first 10 episodes. Hey, Pursuit of Purpose listeners, today I have a special episode for you. I was asked recently by Julie Hawley from the Conscious Investor podcast to join her podcast. Kind of cool. She is in Bonners Ferry, North Idaho, so it's just a little north of where I live here in Coeur d'Alene. But we had a podcast episode that was covering the topic of podcasting. And so this was kind of cool for me. I normally don't get, a lot of opportunities to be asked the questions because I'm always the one asking. But I had a fantastic conversation with Julie. We went over kind of the takeaways from for me personally having 100 episodes. And I think it's kind of fitting that this is the 100th episode that I will post is this podcast episode. And again, her podcast is called The Conscious Investor. Fantastic. I looked through some of her content. You'll see in the upcoming conversation, a lot of overlap with what she's doing and what I'm doing. And we just had a great time talking about, pushing your comfort zone, how anyone can get value out of a podcast, setting an initial goal if you're going to launch a podcast. Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly, a personal brand and how this affects your personal brand, and then how this is a cheat code. Just podcasting itself is a cheat code for launching or getting in front of people and having conversations with people that you might not otherwise have. So check out this conversation. Look up Julie. She's doing some great things, and enjoy.
Conscious investor, vulnerability, transparency, all the masks, everything comes off the moment you put yourself behind a camera in front of a mic. Today, my guest has done that and has learned a lot of lessons over 100 episodes of podcasting. And it's really interesting because, Conscious Investor, you've reached out to me before about starting your own podcast and you've asked for tips. You know who you are, and it happens quite regularly. And I love those conversations. And in that conversation, every time we talk about who we are, and who we are becomes really vulnerable because we're exposed. All these lessons, although we're going to be talking about this from the lens of a podcaster, Conscious Investor, this is going to just be a treasure trove of opportunity for you to assess and evaluate what is it you're doing in life and how are you amplifying the greatest skills, tools, abilities, traits that you have over life, and where are those going to take you? So I don't want to talk on any further because I'm so excited to have not just a podcaster, but someone that actually lives in proximity to me in North Idaho. So Chris, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us on The Conscious Investor.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so grateful that you were bold and reached out to me on Messenger and got this set up.
Okay, so let's just talk about that because you said, wow, that was probably easy for you. We were talking about like, hey, reaching out to strangers, random people. And by the way, I just want to give a shout out to the Man on the Mission podcast. So Conscious Investor, check that out. But also, I'll get there in a moment, because that's how I discovered you. I was, looking into the Man on the Mission, platform and what they were up to. And then I see the Pursuit of Purpose podcast. I'm like, what is this? I mean, that's very Conscious Investor-esque, the whole title and thesis. And like, okay, I have to dig into this further. And that's how I discovered you. I want to know, I don't have any problem reaching out to strangers. I will reach out to anybody. But what's that been like for you as you are diving down the path, more than 100 episodes in to podcasting? What was it like reaching out to those guests initially?
Yeah, I would say that I think there's a TED Talk. This is everything. I have like stories for everything. So there's a TED Talk that I saw one time. It was called 100 Days of Rejection. I don't know if you've seen this.
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah. And I don't remember when I saw this, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but I'll summarize it into like, all of us have fears that are, 99% of them are not really grounded in anything, or they're, just our primal nature, or, the caveman in us that's like wanting to avoid being killed or mauled by a tiger or whatever,
Right.
and to the degree that you're willing to face those fears, I think is like related or correlated with the opportunities that come into your life, the success that you're going to have, the fulfillment that you have in life. And this guy in this TED talk, he like literally just was like first of all, self-awareness to say, I am severely limited in how scared I am to do anything, that he then decided, I'm going to do 100-day challenge for myself. And he documented it. And every day I'm going to try to get rejected for something new, something different that I haven't been rejected for. And you watch his TED talk and it's like so inspiring and also hilarious, because it's not like he just was cold calling every day for 100 days, but it's like, I have to come
Right.
up with a new way to get rejected. So he, like, the ones that stuck out to me was he went into like a Krispy Kreme donut shop and was like, can you make my donuts into the Olympic emblem? And they're like, I I think so. No one's ever asked us. So like the lady like does it and is like, here you go. And he's like, crazy. Like, or he was on Southwest Airlines and he said, can I make the safety briefing announcement on the intercom? Which is like, that's one for me. I was like, who in the hell would ever like is that? And then the other part of me is like, actually, I wonder if he was able to do that. Is that even allowed? And it turns out that that's not legally allowed, that the crew has to. But they did say, we'll let you make an announcement. And so he's just like, hey, what's up? My name's Ryan or whatever. And that was like, so that idea is, I think, one of the things that in thinking about this podcast and just like, what have I learned from 100 episodes? I would say that number one is anybody can get value out of making their own podcast. Anybody. And I would say, what should that topic or the podcast be about? And I would, first of all, I would tell anybody that's debating, like, should I do this or should I not? It's just literally think of somebody in your life that is inspiring to you, that's interesting, that you wanted to talk to. It could be a best friend. It could be your parent. I even interviewed a high school history teacher of mine who's not like, he's not a public, I mean, he talked to high school kids for his whole career, but that was one of my favorite episodes of all the episodes I've done. And it's like, nobody knows who Mr. McQueen is. You can go back
Right.
and listen to it, but he was literally one of the most memorable teachers I had in my entire life. And I said, hey, do you want to be on my podcast? And he said, what's a podcast? And then
Right.
he's like, sure, I guess so. But it's like, the point is that if you just start and you start having interesting conversations, good things will come out of that. And one of the things you're going to have to face is the fear of being rejected by somebody, or like someone saying like, no, like, why are you doing a podcast? Which no one ever says that. They might, for me, I had the fear of like, people are just going to say, oh, Chris is just jumping on the podcast train. He's got another
Right.
podcast, like everybody else in the world has a podcast. But I still think that if you approach it from the perspective of, this isn't about trying to build an audience, like that's secondary if it happens. This is just all about me leaning into doing something that's uncomfortable, facing rejection, learning from others, getting really good at asking questions. Those were like the things that were motivating me, is that I want to be a leader and I wanted to get better at being curious and learning from every single person that I encounter. So it's like the podcast is this little crucible that I put myself into weekly. And it's like, whoever I'm interviewing, I'm just going to ask a bunch of questions about whatever this person's expertise is, and listen, like really listen to what they're saying and see if I can learn something. And it turns out that you can learn something from pretty much everybody in the world. But oftentimes we, just go through life and we're focused on, the popular person that we can see. And you realize that there's friends in your life that have so much wisdom and knowledge that you never took the time to unpack.
Oh my gosh. There are 100 million things there. Done. I'm not asking any other questions. We're just going to sit here and park it here.
Yeah.
No, I just love that. In Conscious Investor, I know that you're hearing these. You can see exactly why I wanted to invite Chris onto the podcast. You're hearing the words like curious, asking good questions, like just being aware and putting ourselves in the position of discomfort. And when we do that, that's when we open ourselves up to so much opportunity in all of life. And that's where the excitement takes place. the literally things that I talk about on a regular basis, I think is interesting. And the conscious investor is well aware of this, when I started my podcast, Ask Me How I Know, Multifamily Stories of Struggle to Success, such a mouthful. When you're trying to get SEO or rich or anything, it kind of gets crazy. But all that to say, I started with the exact same premise of, I just need to do this for me, and I'll serve as many people as I can, but I live in the middle of the nowhere. How am I going to actually connect and grow my network with, within the multifamily investment space? How am I going to do that from Little Bonners Ferry, Idaho, and stand by a thesis, invest where you want to live, like live where you want to live, invest where it makes sense. And so, from that this podcast was birthed, and then it morphed and grew into the conscious investor. And through that, now I have this vision of a global movement. So it's really interesting to see how, when we start out on a path, how it evolves and transforms as we evolve and transform. So with that, Chris, I think the question I have then for you is, what is the biggest transformation that you've seen within yourself over the progression of these 100 episodes? If you go back to episode, where you have your trailer episode to episode over 100, what took place with you internally?
Well, I would say I think I'm just going to throw out these 5 points and we could dive into any one of them. But this was, I would say, it's the realization of these 5 things that I think is the takeaway for me. The first one, which I mentioned, is anyone in the world, I really believe this, could get so much value out of a podcast. And there's a couple reasons why, but the first thing I would say to someone that is doing it, and this is also like, I had this goal initially for myself, was I picked a number of episodes and I just said, I'm going to do 30 episodes and I'm not going to second guess or question or let self-doubt or anything stop me. I'm doing 30 episodes, like no matter what. That's my goal. And then I gave myself permission after 30 episodes. I preemptively said, once you reach 30, like whether that takes you a year or a month or whatever the time frame, like it doesn't matter how long, but you cannot give this goal up until you check that box. And once I reached 30, then I said, okay, let's think about this. And I did take a break for like probably 4 months or something, just because of life stuff and having kids and everything. But I loved those first 30 episodes so much that I was like, I need to keep doing this. So that's the second thing, is just set an initial goal and then stick to it. Because I feel like I heard a statistic somewhere that there's millions and millions of podcasts, and like there's like 70% of them have like less than 2 episodes, or so. It was some ridiculous stat, right? But it's so logical that you make something, you set a goal, you cast this vision, and you jump in, and like the first 2 are pretty terrible and you're like stuttering over your words and you don't like your audio and the camera sucks and all this. But if you set a goal and you just stick to that and then do it, that now you actually have something to analyze. You can't analyze a one-off like thing.
No.
The third thing is ties into what it takes to set a goal and hit it, is the saying, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly, and giving yourself the grace and the permission to suck at it. And I have had to battle, even today, I've debated deleting my first 10 episodes.
What?
Because I'm like, they're so, especially the first one, like literally the first episode, it was called The Chris Kiefer Show. And I was like, there was no intro, there was nothing. I was just like, it was a entrepreneur that I admired, Mike Choi. It's a fantastic episode, but the audio sucks. There's no video. And it was 5 years ago. And it started with like Jaws music, and there's a reason why, that Mike's favorite movie was Jaws. So I just like put it in the beginning. And so it's like, there's so many things that I objectively look back, I'm like, it's such a terrible episode, but I never would. And I'm such a big believer in this. And this is something that I learned from Gary Vaynerchuk. I don't know, 8 years ago, when I started reading his stuff and following him online, is just, you have to document and don't focus on creating content, but just like have conversations. And how cool it is for everybody that knows who Gary Vaynerchuk is, that you can go back and see episode 1 of Wine Library TV and how terrible it was, and how exciting that is for me and everybody else that wants to do something, that you see the Gary V today, and it's this, $100 million empire. And it's like, how in the heck do you do that? Or why, or whatever. And it's like, just go look at his start, and that's so exciting. So I've intentionally left that. And I've also, like, there's the voice in my head of what would happen. Like, am I going to lose a listener because they go to episode 1 and listen to it and they're like, oh, this is terrible. And it's like, maybe, but if that is the case, like, I probably don't need that person following me anyways, because
Probably
the whole
not the right
point,
listener.
and they also need to see, oh, look at the date this was released, and now let's watch a more recent episode, So I just think that's inspiring. And I want to also point out, like you said, it was literally called The Chris Kiefer Show. I was struggling to find a name. And I feel like, how often do people literally, they're like, it's like, I want to start a business. And then they spend a year trying to come up with a logo and a name. It's like, just make the damn business. Like, go to the bank, set up like CLK Enterprises, make a bank account, go. And then you can, like, just the freedom in action is huge. And then the last thing is, there's 2 other quick ones, is personal brand. So I do think that as you gain momentum, and this is very hard to measure, but I do believe that, once I reach 500 episodes, because I legitimately feel like I'm going to podcast for the rest of my life, solely because I despise the how's the weather conversations. Just like, hey, did you see that game last night? Yeah, it's crazy, man. I thought for sure he was across that 50-yard line. It's just like all this nonsense that I'm so drawn to, like, personal development and actual, like, substance, and just like I just want to jump into a conversation and be like, what's the biggest regret you have in life? Like, and like, I've met you 5 minutes ago, but let's just talk about real stuff instead of just staying in this like superficial space. And the podcast, in a weird way, just provides that, like, it's like a weird container that people feel more comfortable to share stuff that they wouldn't if you were just having coffee. Cause, like, there's this third party listening, that is there. And then, sorry, I know I'm just rambling, but the fifth point
I'm taking notes. Don't worry.
Okay.
A conscious
We'll come
investor,
back and
got
go
you
back.
covered. I'm writing your questions down over here because I am tracking with the conscious investor mentally.
Okay. And this is my last one. Is the other reason why I would tell anybody to do a podcast is it's a cheat code for getting an interview, for getting time with someone that wouldn't normally meet with you. Like, I've said this so many times, that starting out, first of all, if you've never done an episode, it might be difficult, but like you've experienced, I was going to say, you've done 300, 400 episodes now, right? The Conscious
Over
Investor.
400.
Yeah. So, like, the consistency that someone can objectively see from the outside of, I don't really care how many listeners you have, because I can see that this is something that you prioritize and you've honed and you're investing time into, that there is real value in, like, a track record of, like, showing up. Right. And so I think that what that does, and I've had this happen where, like, I'm trying to think of the one of, like, the most celebrity type people, which is super niche, but because the Conscious Investor is a marketing director, they probably know the Harmon Brothers. I don't know if you know the Harmon Brothers. They're the big internet agency that is behind, like, Poopery and Squatty Potty and all these, like, viral internet ads.
Mm-hmm.
The CEO, Benton Crane, he's now actually, they have a new CEO, but when I did this, I reached out to them and I was like, oh, I wonder if he'd be on here. And it's, like, again, such a niche, like, popular person that most people are like, I don't know who this guy is, but he came on the podcast, and it's like, I get to pick the CEO of this company of Harmon Brothers at the time when I was running my own marketing company. And, like, I couldn't have just emailed him and be like, hey, do you have an hour for me to just ask you a bunch of questions about how you built your business? He's not going to say yes to that. But because there's a podcast that has a following, and like, you're scaling that person's time. So, like, I can ask a bunch of questions, and if they're good questions, now he could share that with someone else in the future, maybe. And there's just, like, that aspect. So those are the 5 things I would say, just, like, anybody can do this and actually get real value. Set an initial goal. Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. it helps your personal brand to some degree, whatever like avenue you're going on in life now or in the future. Having a podcast of like content, I just believe is, especially if you're authentic in each of those 100, 500 episodes, whatever it is, like there's just value in being you. And then the last thing is, everybody wants to pick the brain of the person that's farther down the path. And a podcast gives you a little cheat code to punch in like a heavier weight class than you're in at the moment.
I love these 5 points so much. And I can definitely relate to the, cheat code to get to the, top tier people. And I remember asking in the commercial, real estate space, specifically multifamily investing. I remember at the very get-go asking people who are like, oh, that's your event, that's your platform, these huge people, and just, okay, what do I have to lose? And inviting them to the show. And for that very purpose of, it's a win-win. Everybody wins. I get to ask questions. They get to have free marketing, free promotion, all of that. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. I want to go back to the beginning when you're talking about this goal and the commitment. By the way, I made a year-long commitment. And every year, Conscious Investor, this, every year on the birthday of the podcast, I decide and I'm recommit. I'm like, okay, am I committed for the next year or not? I actually really committed for 3 years initially, but I told myself 1 year because I'm like, nothing really happens in 1 year. You have to have a body of evidence. Year one, it's an infant. Year two, it's an adolescent. It's a toddler. It's still developing personality. 100%. And then year 3, you should actually see like, where is this going? What is this growing into? And this relates, Conscious Investor, to all of life. Like we can't just like dabble into something and expect to see results. We can't expect to go to the gym for 5 days and see like rock hard abs, right? So, but you gave yourself permission and you said, I gave myself permission. I'm going to do 30 episodes and then I'm going to give myself permission. And I obviously can resonate with that myself, but I'm wondering, where did you learn that? So a lot of people will say like, oh yeah. And maybe they watched Brene Brown's, TED Talk, or something like that. And they saw that, okay, I'm going to write a note, permission to myself. But where did that come from for you?
I would say, like, if I'm going to give a really analytical answer, it probably came from a podcast or a book that I listened to, because I just consume audio like breathing.
A junkie.
But yeah, I would say that's realistically where it came from. But I would say the other real thing that I've experienced is in business, in life, and just like things, if you don't have an end goal, and it's actually today is the, we're recording this on August 18th. Who knows when you're going to release this, but my dad died 12 years ago. And the idea of death is something that I've always been super passionate about. Like one of my favorite interview questions when I had a little marketing company, we had 8 employees, and I would ask people, what do you want people to say about you at your funeral? Which is a Stephen Covey question. And I'm like, but I just was like, I want to know if people have like a vision or like a plan, like what is motivating them, and why, like, have they even thought about it? Because sometimes people are just like, I don't know. And they literally like, they come up with an answer that's authentic and that's cool. But I love just diving into that. And the reason is because there's an end. Like, start with the end in mind. That's like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You have to have, why am I doing this? And you have to have an end date. Like the number of times in life where, I would say this happens frequently in business, where it's like, we're going to track a new KPI. We're going to track website visitors and we're going to report on it in our Monday meeting. And what happens? It's like, no one was clear on how long we're doing this, why we're doing this. Are we ever going to reevaluate if this is necessary? And we'd say we had 1,000 visitors, and then the next month we had 1,100 visitors, and then we had 1,110 visitors, and now all of a sudden this metric is getting stale, and people kind of tune out, and it's like, why are we doing this? We don't remember. And then eventually, like, it just kind of fades away, and we don't do it anymore. And that I think is a really toxic thing in life and business, to have these commitments to something and not being clear about when we are going to reevaluate. because I've even had like a Bible study or a men's group or whatever, where it's like, hey, we're going to start this thing. And it's just it's an indefinite on one level, but we all know it's not going to go on forever. But because we aren't clear that this is a 6-week sprint, or like there's going to be 12 meetings, like the time frame makes all the attendance of every meeting much higher, because we know that I can't skip this week because there's only 2 left.
Scarcity.
But if there's no end, it's just like, we're going to do this forever. Then it just kind of slowly fades into the abyss, and then it just vanishes. So I knew that for the podcast, if I said, this is the thing that has to happen and I will do this, and then I can say, I'm never doing podcasting again. But I needed to, and I think the 30, or like you said, a year or 3-year commitment or something, I do think that like 3 years is very impressive, that subconsciously, like, I need to stick this out. But I would say, like, again, even if it's 10, I think 10's like the lowest number I would say you should give yourself the goal of. I would say 20 to 40 is probably, there's just so much nuance that happens. And this is for podcasting in particular, but it's that idea of like, I knew that I didn't want this to be, I want to be a man of my word. And if I say I'm going to do something, I want to be able to point and step back and say, I did that. And I did exactly what I said I was going to do. And I stopped when I said I was going to stop. And now I have the freedom to move on. And I think that if you don't do that, you end up at many points in life just kind of, now if you say you're going to do anything, are you actually going to do it? Like you said, you're going to go to the gym, but nobody's watching and you didn't go to the gym today. Like, that has real massive impacts on your life, I believe, that you just start to not trust yourself. So
that's where I was literally just going to take that, is like, you lose credibility with yourself. And conscious investor, we've talked about this before on the podcast. Like, it's absolutely critical that I'm obsessed with that concept of like, when you look at the mirror, what are you seeing? Do you trust that person? Do you stand behind that person? Do you respect that person? And if our actions are not congruent with with what we want, our goals, like we're sabotaging everything. The mission is going to fail.
Yes, 100% agree.
Gosh, I love this concept though of, and it's really leveraging timelines, right? It's saying, hey, I'm going to compress everything so that I have the level of necessity is raised. And I know I got to show up because I can't just put this task off. Like, if people are participating in the 12-week year, things like that, like, you're just raising the bar and saying like, this has to happen. It really is important and it's critical. So I absolutely love that. And and we were talking off air, about losing our dads and, memento mori from the Stoics of just always living with death in mind. I've been very comfortable with that. My husband laughs because I told him recently, I didn't think I was going to live to be 12. That's so ridiculous. But when I turned 12, I was like, oh my gosh, I lived. I get to be 12. It's a really weird thought for a kid. I was a weird kid, but but it's interesting when we really value life. And I have to say, if you haven't watched Life in Pieces, just watch the first episode with your wife. And Conscious Investor, just watch the very first episode, because I'm going to spoil it a little bit, only a smidge. It's hilarious, but it opens up with the father giving his own eulogy at his funeral. He did an entire mock funeral for himself because he's like, well, what? I want to enjoy it. I mean, like, I want to hear what everybody's going to say about me. I want to participate in this whole concept. It's a funny show, but even that concept of, just always living with that concept of death in mind really shifts how we live the day to day. Because it's not just, oh, I'm just doing this, I just got to check the box. It's like, I don't know about you, but every day I wake up like, thank you, Lord, for these heartbeats. Thank you. What's the purpose today? What are we doing today? Like, let's go.
100%. Yeah. I think that the gratitude, that place of gratitude, just in the Man on a Mission group that I'm in, someone just gave a talk yesterday, actually. And it's just like, we've heard these things before, but they just hit at different points of your life differently. And he said, the classic saying of, a healthy man has many wishes, but a unhealthy man has only one, and that is to be healthy again. And I feel like that's the, like, it's so true. And the reason he brought that up was the things that come easy to us in life are easy to forget that we have or that we should be grateful for. So it's like, I'm fit, I'm healthy, I have two legs, I can see out of both of my eyes, I have, a house, I have a bed, like all these things that are just like, I love the physical ones too, because just like how often do we literally take for granted our health or the fact that we
Oh
can think
gosh.
critically or be self-aware? Like there are people that you get in an accident and you have a traumatic brain injury and like, or you just are not gifted with, I feel like for myself, the ability to think critically and be self-aware is like the most, I don't know where that came from. I don't know how my parents, like in what way they gave that to me, but like that's so big. And how often do I just like take that for granted? And you see people that struggle in life to do anything. It's like they don't have that ability to observe themselves and say like, where am I struggling where I don't need to be? Or why am I running into walls? And they're just are caught in that trap. So anyways, I think that's, yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying.
Well, I want to go down that rabbit hole for a second. So what do you do? And I'm going to say, it's funny. I was listening to my friend's podcast yesterday on overcoming overwhelm, and literally, Conscious Master, this came directly. It's not a podcast I listen to regularly, and it just showed up and appeared. And I've been feeling overwhelmed. Lots of great personal growth taking place, and when that happens, for me, I like to just pause. Marcus Aurelius did this when he is out there in the middle of craziness. He pauses and takes time to write. He takes time to reflect and to just like get down and like stay at ground zero, basically. And so listening to that podcast actually gave me some reminders and of like, yes, I know I need to, yeah. I mean, he and I are very similar in our thinking and philosophy. So I'm like, oh, thank you, Lord, for like sending that my direction, because I needed those reminders.
Yes.
By the way, Conscious Investor, I'll drop a link to that podcast episode, Hal Elrod's episode on that in the show notes. But what is one of the techniques you do that allows you to stay self-aware when things are getting squirrely around you? I mean, you and I, we both have families, we have careers, we have lots of stuff going on. So overwhelm is real, scattered is real, all of that.
Yeah, I would say I wish that I was more disciplined in like daily journaling. And I even said I'm learning and working through that. Even that language is dangerous because I don't really, if I did, then I would do it. But I struggle with being consistent about journaling. I have gone through periods where I've like, the 3 things you're grateful for, first thing when you wake up, and the 3 things you're excited about when your day starts, and 3 things you're grateful for when your day ends, or things like that. But I would say, I know I've done that and it's been valuable, but I would say the most, probably 2 things I would boil it down to for me personally. One is just like daily routine. I do CrossFit not every day, 4 days a week. I have averaged going to the gym 4 days a week for probably the last like 3 years. If I don't go to the gym, my day, I have less energy. I'm less optimistic. I'm like, don't think clearly. So that's one. But the other thing that is so, so massive, and this was like 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, was the first time that I was a part of a coaching group or had a coach for my life at all. And I would say hands down, and again, there's possible that there's shitty coaches out there that are not going to serve, but I joined this group. Matt Lachlan, who's in Coeur d'Alene, he had this coaching group, and I knew him from church and was like, I'm going to join this group. And from that group, you're in a room of 10 people that are all, willing to spend money, put money on the table, like skin in the game to improve themselves. And the interesting thing was that it wasn't a bunch of marketing people, because at the time I was in a marketing director role. It was just people that were like wanting to do better, become a better version of themselves. And they all paid money, which increases the chance they're going to show up every week. And from that group, I met Jonathan, who is a life coach, and then he started working with my wife in ramping up a review software that we own. And then through that, like I had conversations with him, and then ultimately I joined that coaching group again. And then we hired Jonathan as our personal business coach and life coach, but he's just a marketing wizard and a genius, and helped me work through so many unconscious drivers, where UCDs is what he calls them, of
Yeah.
things that like I never realized I was either running from or were driving or dictating my behavior, or like unconsciously motivating me to succeed, until I faced some of these things. And so I would say, uh the back to the question of like, how do I get myself in that place? I have a weekly meeting with Jonathan for an hour every Friday. It was actually right before this podcast, of like, I sit down, and there's usually like, I'm not someone that vents. I hate venting in general, but it's like my time to basically say like, here's what's on my mind. And then he listens and he's like, all right, so I'm hearing this and this and this, when he just reflects back to me what he's hearing. And
Mhm.
even today, there are certain things where I said them. And as soon as I said them, I was like, this is so, like, it's not even an issue. I just needed to speak it. Or again, this is where
Right.
journaling, I think, comes into real value. You need to throw it out there so you can hear yourself say it, or see yourself write it and then read it or hear it back. And you're like, yep, I already know what to do. Like, this is just, I'm going to like cut that out or do this thing instead. And now I'm off and I'm free to move forward. And I feel like I would just say again, coaching is so valuable for any stage of life. And I think that that is probably the number one thing that anyone that wants to increase or do better or become a better version of themselves. I can't, like, I'm not a coach. I'm just a big advocate for coaching, that if you have someone who's skilled in listening and just asking you really challenging, good questions, the value of that is so valuable.
You just summarized coaching so well. It is the highest level of listening so that you can ask questions. So I actually do coach, and I have a very select group of clients. I don't carry many. It's a very select group of clients. All that to say, it is just that. And sometimes it's exhausting because it's such intense listening. It's like listening
Mm.
between the lines, listening beneath the surface, everything like that. But everything that I have, I'll just echo. I've been able to grow and transform so much. God worked through the coach that I was working with, and I didn't
Mhm.
even understand. So I had a mentor who's helping me with the technical side of all of my investing. And then I had an actual high performance coach that was helping me with the mental side of it. I didn't even know I was in the coaching program that I'd have access to this performance coach. And it literally was a game changer for me. And now it's revolutionized my life.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I would say that one of my favorite things that I or tell people about coaching is, people will ask, like, well, like, I've had family members or friends like, well, what do you do like in the coaching group? What's the curriculum or whatever? And it's like, I'm not very good at like selling like that. It's like we literally sit in a room and someone talks, like gives a speech, and then we kind of all go into pods and we talk about what we're trying to achieve or whatever. And they're like, that's it. Like, I could just do that with my buddies. Like, why would I pay for that?
Because your
And
buddies aren't paying, and they're not, that's
yes,
the level
the
of
more you
commitment.
pay, the more you pay attention. And I've seen that over and over and over
Absolutely.
again. And the other thing is that the biggest thing I would say with coaching, and when someone's questioning the value, is to first realize that the coach, the value that the coach provides is dependent on who you are and what opportunities you have in front of you. And this came to me one day when I was talking to someone about like, oh, you're paying how much per month or whatever. And it's like, if I hired Michael Jordan's trainer, or let's say like a current one, LeBron James, if I hired LeBron James trainer at this point in my life to make me a better basketball player, what's the value of that to me right now? Like, I would probably get better at basketball, but I'm like, am I going to make a bunch of money off of this? Like, no. If I would have hired him when I was in college, or high school when I actually had like this basketball was a potential. I played college basketball, but I like the timing is key, but also who you are and your skill and your natural ability is going to dictate what this person's time is worth. So like for me, I probably could have only justified, $50 an hour if I'm going to look at like an ROI. But for LeBron James to have that same coach work with him every day, it's tens of millions of dollars. Like the disproportionate value is so dependent on where you're at, what opportunities you have. So I would say that for finding a coach, you do have to find the coach that's the right coach for you at the right time and the group. But I do think that it's good to spend like an uncomfortable amount, not like ridiculous, but push yourself, stretch yourself a little bit, because you will grow into the value.
Yes.
As long as you're, and this may be the other caveat, you're an entrepreneur, or you're in a business where there's like leadership or potential for increased income or whatever. But like for an entrepreneur, like coaching is the biggest no-brainer ever, because you actually are in a place where you can increase income, scale into new ideas and opportunities. You have the freedom to like play the game the way you want to play. And it's like everybody needs a coach. If you're an employee, you probably couldn't benefit from a coach, but obviously you're not going to be able to justify spending as much, because their value that you could gain is not quite as high.
That's a really great way of saying this. And now I'm going to have to do this totally awkward thing. Conscious investor, I think this has happened maybe like one other time ever, but I'm going to have an abrupt ending. Usually I'm like, we've been so engrossed in conversation and the time is just like flying by. And I've valued and loved every minute of this. Like your points, anyone can get value from a podcast, and we have to have, every goal needs that commitment, and anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. We have to develop our personal brand, and podcasting is a cheat code for getting in front of really important people. But amongst all of those, Conscious Investor, we're able to just like mine out so many gems that you can apply to your real everyday life. Evaluate your life. It doesn't have to be a podcast. Evaluate, how is my approach with my family? How is my approach with the friends and the people I say are important to me? How's my commitment and my approach, in my career? And more importantly, what am I doing with the purpose that God created and hardwired me for? Like, you're uniquely created. So what are you doing with that? And so allowing yourself to live that inside out life in breathing that into the world. So I'm so grateful, Chris. Conscious Investor, I want to encourage you, make sure you go check out Chris's podcast, The Pursuit of Purpose. It's amazing and you're going to enjoy it. And as always, please remember, anytime you visit a podcast, including this podcast, you want to say, hey, I've been here and I appreciate your time and your effort. So leave a rating or review on that podcast so that they know that you've been there and that you appreciate it, because there's a lot of time, effort, energy, money, all the resources get poured into creating content that you get to enjoy and appreciate for free. Chris, I just want to say once again, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. And what's the best way the Conscious Investor wants to reach out to you? They're connecting. How can they reach out to you?
Yeah. So I have a website that's just kind of the general, what Chris Kiefer is up to. It's chriskiefer.com. My last name is Kiefer. I always say I before E, always. That's all you need to remember, I before E. But chriskiefer.com. And that's like it's a work in progress for me. What I really do, my full-time job is automation for home service companies and painting in particular. And then we have a review software for home service companies as well. So pretty niche in that world. But as far as like my brand and what I'm interested in, my passions and kind of fatherhood and marketing and technology and all my nerdy stuff and the podcast, that's all at chriskiefer.com. And you can send me an email or reach out, or like you said, you could just listen to the Pursuit of Purpose podcast. But yeah, super fun. I really appreciate your time, Julie, and having me on.
That's great. Conscious Investor, don't be a stranger. Remember, if you're looking for support with your investing, you're wondering which way to go, then please make sure you jump down below in the show notes and schedule a time for us to have a conversation. I'm not scary. It's actually ton of fun. And you can just look at the comments down in the comments section of the podcast to see how many people enjoy real conversations. Until next time, live big, love bigger, and do great things.
Thank you for your attention and listening to this episode of The Pursuit of Purpose. Your feedback and comments mean the world to me. If you liked what you heard, please take a second, leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. If you've got suggestions for future episodes or just want to say hi, shoot me an email at chris@chriskiefer.com. Don't forget, I make it a point to include all the links to the books, movies, and resources mentioned on this episode in the show notes. You can see those directly below in the description or on my website, chriskiefer.com. Thanks so much, guys.